Antonia Tungel from the Albert Ludwigs University in Freiburg. She is an MA student in social and cultural anthropology, and her work focuses on ecology, climate change, and ritual analysis, and is situated in the Alps. And she's discussing the loss of glaciers and how this image is constructed also, right? So we are looking forward to your presentation. Welcome here.
Thank you. Thank you also, Caroline. It's like really a fitting shift now, I think, because I'm also talking about loss, about disappearing landscapes that are loved by some, not so much by others, but like turning to the question behind it, how come that disappearance or change is experienced as loss in the first place? And like, how is this turned into a political narrative maybe as well, and for what reasons, for which means, and for whom maybe it is not a loss. So yeah, glaciers are melting worldwide. You all have seen the pictures. You know that also probably in the Alps, glaciers are melting very, very fast. Germany has still 4 glaciers. I did not know that we even had any glaciers, but we do, but not for, I think, for a couple of like 4 to 5 years from now on, then they also will be gone. And over the Alps, there have been funerals conducted for those dying glaciers. There were a couple of them in the last 5 years. They're all, like, I just briefly skimmed through some pictures. They were all very different in like the visual form, as you can see. Like some are more like specifically Christian, or more like activist or political. But they all kind of ask the same question to us, or actively frame glaciers as something that should matter to us, that we should maybe mourn as a society or something. So I'm going to talk a little bit about glacier funerals, but not so much, because I'm more interested in the question behind that, like what is mourned here exactly? What do we lose when we lose a glacier? And for whom does it matter as a loss? So in climate science, glacier loss, it's also like almost a technical term. Like if you look at those charts here on the left, it seems like an obvious word, like a glacier disappears when it melts, and that's what we call glacier loss. But then interestingly, also in like glaciology, there's not really a universally applied definition of when a glacier ceases to be a glacier. It depends on technologies, on also definitions of what constitutes a glacier, and also the purpose of applying the status of non-glacier to a glacier. So the authority of science here is very strong, because it makes glaciers a legitimate object of loss, but then it's also a contested field in itself. And in the like political or affective dimension, loss is also a very charged word. We have, in the context of global warming, glaciers as like these eternal beings that have been here forever and that are dying because of our actions. They are symbols for irreversible damage and for futures that are slipping away. And today I want to present parts of my thesis, of my research on glacier loss. I've been using the concept of Andreas Reckwitz here. He's a sociologist from Berlin. And he was one of the very few people that I found who really wrote or thought with loss as an analytical concept, like what makes something a loss. And he sort of reminds me that, you know, all the time things are disappearing, all the time, and most of the time we just don't notice it, or we forget it. And it's only certain disappearances that come to matter, like, and why not others? and how exactly are these disappearances then like marked or like also circulated or made political as a loss. So I take his definition, like that's not a quote, it's like I think how he sees loss, it's a social interpretation of disappearance. And then he also coins this concept of doing loss, so loss is not given, we have to actively produce it in social practice. I conducted fieldwork in like several places in the Alps. I mainly focused on the Zugspitze in Germany and the Morteratsch Glacier in Switzerland. But I've also been to other glacier sites, and all of those are places where glacier funerals have been conducted, because my idea was, okay, this is a glacier that has already been publicly marked as a loss, but I want to, like, I don't know, find out more for whom and why, and is it a loss for everyone? So in the end I was in 4 sites, and I chose, like, this is the Eastern Alps. I chose the Eastern Alps. There were also some in the Western Alps because it's like the German-speaking area. And I stayed there for like 3 months in each of the 2 sites in Germany and Switzerland. I conducted interviews with people whose lives are tied to glaciers, for example, glaciologists or tourism operators or mountain rescue service, or also just local residents or like farmers who live downstream and use glacier meltwater. And I will structure my talk around like 3 major parts, like quite shortly because of time, like how glaciers became meaningful at all as a landscape, because in order to experience it as loss, it first has to be charged as a meaningful landscape in the first place. And then I'll talk about how glacier retreat is made perceptible as loss, and then how this loss is also contested and translated into politically like meaningful narratives. So historically, glaciers have been valued very, very differently. And these imaginaries still continue to shape and make possible at all to understand these landscapes as lost landscapes. So in older imaginaries, they were mostly dangerous and threatening places associated with demons or like also divine punishment. Here you have a picture, maybe you've heard the story before, that in the past people were like making processions and prayers to make the glacier retreat because it's threatening the villages and the livelihoods of people. And now actually the priest who lives at Fitch in this village, he like went to the Pope in Rome to ask for an official sanction to like change the prayer. So now they're praying for the glacier to advance. So it's an often cited example of like how that narrative shifted in time. But it also shifted historically, like in the like travel writing, especially romantic like aesthetics. Glaciers became those like sublime places. Like they're still dangerous, they're still like awful. Like you have both this element of horror, but also of like this grand, majestic beauty that's overwhelming you and that makes you very, very small. And this, this is still an experience I think that people can still have today. I had it at least when I visited my first glacier. And with the rise of alpine tourism, there was scientific exploration. Here you have, I think it's a very interesting thing because it's the same hut that was developed into a hotel like a few decades later. The Alps and glaciers were increasingly made accessible and like consumable in a very comfortable way, and they became viewpoints, objects of scientific knowledge. Also the Ice Age theory emerged here, by the way, in Chamonix, and markers of alpine identity, and nowadays they are the most visible indicator for climate change for many, many people. This is, by the way, also the very same viewpoint, like from all the previous images. And that's also very interesting why glaciers came to be this like proof for climate, global warming, because they seem so neutral, so apolitical, they're just melting. This is not something that has to be mediated or explained. Like, you can just look at them, you see them melt, global warming, it makes sense, no discussion. And this is also, I think, because glaciers resemble sort of those open air labs, like they're so removed from human intervention that they're just, pure evidence in themselves. So why I'm telling you all this is because these meanings still exist, all those meaning-making ideas. They did not vanish just because they're historical, they accumulated, they're still in our minds, I think, when we look at glaciers. And they also, make it possible that with the glaciers it's not just ice disappearing, it's like landscapes that have come to matter for us in very multiple ways. But as I also said before, like disappearance and loss is not the same thing. And disappearance has to be somehow witnessed and like emotionally charged, and has to be made available to experience as loss. Like, you need to experience that something is lost. And there are several techniques that I like try to sort of identify a bit also in my research. Like, one obvious example is the glacier funerals, but also these before-after images. You all know them, I guess. There's like the ice-covered first photo, and then only debris in the last photo. You also have the same sort of visual narrative on glacier trails. This is the Morteratsch Glacier trail. Because if you would not have those like trail markers or retreat markers that tell you, okay, here was the glacier in 2015 and so on, it would just be maybe even just a beautiful valley. You would not know, like, you need this point of visual comparison to see the landscape as a landscape of disappearance, and to like have a specific reading of this landscape in relation to what used to be there in the past. There are also other techniques. I just list them and sort of say a few words about them. But there's also, of course, sensing loss. You can sense disappearing ice, like instability, the lack of snow, altered textures. It's something very embodied as well. Narrating loss is also a very essential technique, where the narrator sort of relates what is happening now to a remembered or imagined past, or to an anticipated future. So you have a point of establishment where the present appears as less, as like lacking something or diminished, because it's contrasted against this past in which there was abundance. So it creates a trajectory of decline. Then there's, of course, scientific measurement. I already talked about it, that it's also sort of not universal, but it makes melting categorizable, like it becomes officially recognized as a loss, and of course also has a very particular authority in the making of loss. And those are just examples to like show that loss is not emerging only from absence, it has to be organized somehow and narrated, so it's experienced to others also as a story of loss. But not all experience it as loss. And loss can also be actively undone, and is actively undone by some people that I talk to. And even in the case of the glacier funerals, where people were like all coming together to mourn the glacier, there was not really a consensus on what exactly is being lost here and how important this loss is. For some, the loss was about a changing ecosystem or like a beloved landscape that is changing. For others, it was more about memory and belonging, and for others, it was mainly because it's a climate indicator and it points to other losses that are happening elsewhere. And interestingly, for me, that was one of the most interesting findings, I think, that it was interlocutors who did not live close to the glaciers, but, for example, lived in the cities, who had this urban perspective on like glaciers, for whom it was a highly significant loss. And that was, for them, I think, mostly as symbols for like climate change and as proxies for like broader global losses. While people who lived there and whose livelihood was very much tied to the landscapes, it was acknowledged as a loss, mostly, but it was not a priority. It did not matter that much. Other losses matter much more, and there's like this hierarchy of losses. I think the most pressing loss for most people was snow, like lack of snow, or changing conditions for like alpine safety. But yeah, the loss becomes weighted and compared to other losses, then they are experienced as more direct or immediate. And that was for me also sort of a lesson about like my own expectations. Like, okay, I have an affected community and they have to be emotionally affected somehow. That's a rule. But they, many times they were not. And that was for me very rich as a personal learning experience. And in some cases, it was even like actively unmade. It was mostly by people who worked like in tourism or who maybe have this sort of business mindset, or I don't know, for whom it was more like a challenge, a question of transformation, of adaptation, of like reorganizing values. If like one product is disappearing, like the glacier panorama or something, there will be others. And it opens so many new possibilities and landscapes. And then there were some accounts, and I think people had sort of another understanding of like what it means to be a glacier as well, because they were like talking about how change or like retreating, advancing, this movement is like inherent to glacier ontology, and at the very end we only have this very small glimpse into the life of a glacier, and then it's this huge loss for us and maybe for other mammals or flora and fauna that are here right now with us, but in the long run, it's this very landscape we are standing on is there because glaciers once retreated. And we are protecting this landscape. We find it beautiful, it's our home, but it's only there because glaciers retreated. And yeah. Lastly, I want to like go through the narratives that are sort of emerging, I think, in a political arena that people are using more or less, what's the word, consciously, but I think they are implied a lot of times in the understanding of or how they talk about glaciers and glacier loss. And one that's quite prominent is the glacier as anticipatory ruin. It's the idea that it's anticipatory because the glacier is still there. It's still materially very present, but it's interpreted, it's looked at through its future absence. And it's very common, I think, in activist accounts, but also for many people, like, but the future is like closed. It's already decided there will be an ice-free future in the Alps, and we will be the last generation really to witness alpine glaciers. A very different, no, that's the next one. This is, I think, similar because the glacier is a victim. It's like killed by us. It's definitely dead, or it's going to die. It's killed by us. It's sort of an ethically intensified narrative of the ruin, like murdering it, but not like we, the carbon elite, or like there's questions of responsibility, of accountability, of justice, like who is killing those glaciers. This is the glacier as patient narrative that is a little bit like deferring the idea of the ruin, of like the definite end, extinction, glacier extinction. It's something we can discuss, that we can mitigate, that we can delay. The glacier is terminally ill maybe, or it's like sick, it has to be treated, and we have measurements, we have all sorts of techno fixes that we can experiment with and apply, and maybe not save it, but like delay its end by decades at least. And then lastly, we have the glacier as frontier. That's like the business narrative a little bit, but yeah, it creates new possibilities. If you have all this glacier meltwater, you have huge freshwater storage that you can use for hydropower, for the renewable energy revolution, I don't know. But at the same time, of course, we have water that becomes privatized, that creates like conflicts over ownership and access, and there's going to be, I think it's going to be a huge thing like very soon, or it's already happening in the Alps. The glacier as nature narrative is the one I already outlined a bit more. It's like nature is the dominant force here. It's like a glacier is governed by laws, like by unfolding of natural dynamics that is far grander than us. And for sure there's anthropogenic climate change, but like the just immenseness of nature is something that is so much grander, and we cannot like intervene here meaningfully or relevantly, politically, and that's a kind of a risky, quite a dangerous narrative, I think, because it really limits the scopes for human action. But yeah, like as a landscape of loss, I think there's no single reality here of like a loss, which is something that I sort of assumed, but I did not find it. It's very uneven for whom this loss matters, for whom like who can capitalize from it, for whom it's an emergence of possibilities. And there are very different futures also emerging from this that are, yeah, sometimes closed, sometimes very open to our capacity to imagine like the future alpine world. And yeah, that's it from my side. Thank you.